Good evening. Please welcome to the stage AERA Executive Director, Tabby Chavis.
Good evening. I'm Tabby Chavis, Executive Director of the American Educational Research Association, or AERA. On behalf of AERA, I'm thrilled to welcome all of you attending in person and the thousands of you who are on our live stream to the 22nd Annual Brown Lecture in Education Research, broadcast here live from the Felice J. Levine Convening Center at AERA's headquarters in Washington, D.C. I first acknowledge that tonight's event is being held on the homelands of Indigenous peoples, on Piscataway land. I ask that you join me in recognizing the Indigenous peoples on whose land we gather. AERA is dedicated to advancing knowledge about education through research and scholarship and using this knowledge to improve education and serve the public good. This means we have an unwavering commitment to the critical importance of education as a powerful force for good in the lives of individuals from all backgrounds, and in the health and thriving of our schools, institutions, communities, and the broader society. This commitment brings us together tonight and underpins what we will learn and discuss. We are living in a complex time as a nation, marked by familiar and new challenges to our collective commitment to equity and justice. These themes lie at the heart of tonight's lecture. I want to next acknowledge the generous support of the Friends of the Brown Lecture. Without them, tonight's event would not be possible. Because there are many friends, I can't read each name tonight in my brief time, but they are listed on our screen and acknowledged on our ARA website. To our friends, thank you for your steadfast support of this important event and ongoing dialogue. Similarly, I'm grateful to the Brown Lecture Selection Committee, chaired by Dr. James Anderson, for its time and thoughtful work in identifying a keynote lecturer who could speak with lived experience, expertise, and wisdom to our current moment. I also will take the opportunity to recognize my predecessor, Dr. Felice J. Levine. Appointed AERA's Executive Director in 2002 and serving until 2025, Felice profoundly shaped and advanced the association and field of education research. During her tenure, she championed bold innovation and forward-thinking strategy, expanding AERA's impact and transforming it into a leading voice in the scientific community. Under her leadership, the association deepened its commitment to driving cutting-edge research and ensuring that evidence informs policy and practice. Thank you, Felice. The Brown Lecture is a prime example of AERA's interconnected commitments to innovation and equity. Together, AERA's leadership and governance championed the creation of the Brown Lecture in 2004, not just as a one-time recognition of the Brown v. Board decision, but as an annual event. This affords a community opportunity open to all to continually explore, educate, and dialogue around the complexity of Brown and its legacy, and to stimulate new research and new action. As both a longtime member of AERA and now its new executive director, I am proud and honored to build on and advance AERA's values-driven and evidence-informed mission, undergirded by an unapologetic commitment to equity, inclusion, and justice. I am now pleased to introduce AERA President, Maisha T. Nguyen. Dr. Nguyen is the Excellence in Learning Graduate School of Education professor at Stanford University and faculty director of the Stanford Accelerator for Learning, Equity and Learning Initiative. In addition, she serves as the principal investigator of the Futuring for Equity Lab. She's authored and co-edited multiple books and published in journals such as Review of Research in Education, Anthropology and Education Quarterly, and more. In addition to serving as AERA president, Dr. Nguyen was a 2022-23 Andrew W. Mellon Fellow at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford, and is a member of the National Academy of Education. Already, it has been a pleasure for me to partner with and support Dr. Nguyen's vision and commitment to a more just educational system and society. Maisha, I'm so delighted to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Tabby. It is such a joy to work with you. And thank you to our in-person audience, as well as the thousands of individuals and watch parties joining us on live stream for being a part of this special event. For more than 2 decades, the Brown Lecture has highlighted the important role of research in advancing understanding of equality and equity in education. The lectureship was inaugurated in 2004 to commemorate the 50th anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education decision, in which the U.S. Supreme Court drew on scientific research to guide its landmark ruling. The Brown Lecture is a powerful annual reminder of how research can promote equality across racial and ethnic groups, countries of origin, economic classes, languages, gender and sexual identities, and other dimensions that enrich our society. Each year, we select as our speaker a preeminent scholar whose work has contributed substantially to the fight for justice and equity in education. During a challenging time for our country, for public education and education research, we are fortunate for the work and insight of our 2025 Brown Lecture speaker, Dr. James A. Banks. Dr. Banks is the Carrie and Linda Killinger Endowed Chair in Diversity Studies, Emeritus, and founding director of the Center for Multicultural Education, now the Banks Center for Educational Justice at the University of Washington. Widely regarded as the father of multicultural education, he is renowned for his work in social studies and global citizenship education. His research focuses on how educational institutions can improve race and ethnic relations and support the academic achievement of diverse groups. Banks has influenced schools, colleges, and universities across the United States and the world, particularly in improving racial and ethnic relations. His authored books include Teaching Strategies for Ethnic Studies, Culture, Diversity in Education, Foundations, Curriculum, and Teaching, Educating Citizens in a Multicultural Society, and Race, Culture, and Education, the selected works of James A. Banks. He has edited several books, including the Handbook of Research on Multicultural Education, Diversity and Citizenship Education Global Perspectives, and Citizenship, Education, and Global Migration, Implications for Theory, Research, and Teaching. He is also the editor of the Multicultural Education book series published by Teachers College Press. Dr. Banks is a past president and fellow of AERA. He received AERA's 2023 Distinguished Contributions in Research Education and Education Award, the inaugural 2004 Social Justice in Education Award, and 1994 Review of Research Award. He is a member of the National Academy of Education and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and a fellow at the National Council for Social Studies. We are honored for the opportunity to learn from Dr. Banks' knowledge and wisdom as he reflects on the impact of the Brown decision in this current social and political moment. Please join me in welcoming the 2025 Brown Lecture in Education Research speaker, Dr. James A. Banks.
I would like to thank President Maisha Nguyen for the kind introduction. I am grateful to the AERA committee that chose me to present the 22nd Brown Lecture in Education Research. I would like to recognize Professor Cherry A. Banks, my wife and colleague. We have shared a rich and rewarding personal and intellectual journey for 56 years. Cherry has given me an unwavering support during our shared quest for social justice and equality. It takes two, doesn't it? At least two. I would like to acknowledge my dean, Mia Twan, at the University of Washington College of Education, and my colleagues at the University of Washington College of Education who are watching this event. Being at the University of Washington for a half century has been a golden opportunity where I have thrived and been enriched. I would also like to thank Tony Pauls and his staff here at AERA who've tried to make me perfect in presenting this address. So if I'm not, blame Tony. The title of my lecture is Rethinking Brown When Diversity and Equity Are Imperiled and Democracy is Fragile. In a landmark decision that would evoke silence, loss, rage, and hope, the Supreme Court described the harmful consequences that would result for African American students who were forced to attend racially segregated schools. The court said, separating children solely because of their race generates a feeling of inferiority as to their status in the community that may affect their hearts and minds in a way unlikely ever to be undone. Looking back when this decision was made 71 years ago, we can vividly describe its achievements, but also its shortcomings, as several previous Brown lecturers have done. These shortcomings include the closing of Black schools that were significant community centers, the firing of many Black teachers and principals, and the racial anguish, pain, and suffering experienced by the first Black students who attended predominantly white schools in the South, such as Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, that were hostile to Black students. Some of these students had to face angry white parents and students who shouted racial slurs at them as they were protected by police and the National Guard, such as Elizabeth Eckrod in this photograph. However, I would like to describe the complex responses to the Brown decision that occurred in my community when it was handed down on May 17, 1954. I was in the 7th grade at the Newsom Training School in Aubrey, Arkansas. And my most powerful memory of the Brown decision is that I have no memory of it being rendered or mentioned by my parents, teachers, or preachers. In my rural Southern community, there was a conspiracy of silence about Brown. It was completely invisible to me as a child. I can only speculate about the meaning of the silence about Brown in my Arkansas Delta community, in which racial segregation was codified in both law and custom in every aspect of our lives. The only public library in Lee County was 9 miles from our farm in Marianna, the county seat that had a population of 4,550. Although I was an avid reader, I could not use the public library. It was for whites only. The only time I saw the inside of the public library was when the choir from my all-black high school entertained a white civic group in the library. We had to see second-run movies at the all-black Blue Heaven Theater. To see first-run movies, we had to go to the white Imperial Theater and enter the colored entrance, which led upstairs where the projector room was also located. We could hear the rattle of the movie projector as we tried to view the movie. Marianna and Lee County, Arkansas epitomized the institutionalized discrimination, fear, and racism that existed throughout the Deep South in the mid-1950s. The conspiracy of silence about Brown in Lee County among whites was probably caused by the fear that the news of Brown might disrupt the institutionalized racist system of segregation that had been established in Lee County in the years after Reconstruction. That system was never publicly challenged or questioned by whites or blacks. Black resistance to racism in Lee County was deep but covert. Blacks wore masks as they feigned contentment around whites, as their anger seethed below the surface, ready to explode. The statue of Robert E. Lee that towered above the park in the town square symbolized the racial oppression that gripped the community in which I and many other Southern blacks came of age in the 50s and 60s. My teachers and preachers surely knew about the Brown decision and must have been quietly joyous about it. However, it must also have evoked fear in them as well about losing their jobs in their schools. They must have quietly discussed Brown among themselves, out of the earshot of the children and certainly out of the earshot of whites. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People took the 5 cases that constituted the Brown decision to the Supreme Court. White establishments throughout the Deep South regarded the NAACP as a subversive and dangerous organization. It was viewed with as much suspicion and animosity as the Communist Party in the North. Black teachers were often fired by school boards in the South when it was learned that they were members of the NAACP. White school boards controlled both black and white schools. Consequently, for black teachers to spread the word about the Brown decision, especially among students, would have been considered a subversive and dangerous act. The silence about Brown that haunted Lee County and the lack of actions related to it throughout my elementary and high school years was quite evident. I attended Newsom Training School until I graduated and then entered all-black Robert Russell Moton High School in Marianna. Moton, a protege of Booker T. Washington, became principal of Tuskegee Institute when Washington died. Many black schools in the Deep South were named for Moton. Throughout my elementary and high school years, and without any focus on Brown or school desegregation, our black teachers taught us to be citizens of both the Black community and American society. Each day in morning exercise, we said the Pledge of Allegiance and sang both the Negro National Anthem, Lift Every Voice and Sing, and the American National Anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner. The lives and triumphs of Black leaders, such as Marian Anderson, George Washington Carver, and Booker T. Washington, were studied in our social studies lesson. Our teachers tried hard to make us productive citizens of U.S. society, as well as to instill in us a commitment to uplift the Black community. Yet, I can remember no explicit efforts by our teachers to prepare us to function within a desegregated society, a society whose possibilities my teachers may have hoped for, but had not fully imagined or grasped. When I graduated from Moton High School in 1960, which was 4 years after Brown, the schools in Mariana and Lee County were tightly segregated, and there was not even a whisper about desegregating them. This picture shows what can happen to you in 60 years. the school desegregation in Mariana was a trickle, began with a trickle in 1964. Brown was an expression of those aspects of American civic culture that articulate democratic values, such as those embedded in the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. By ruling that de jure segregation was illegal because it damaged the hearts and minds of Black students, the Supreme Court gave credence to the values stated in the nation's founding documents and consequently gave Blacks hope. There has always been, and there remains, a wide gap between America's democratic ideals and its practices. Although Brown reflected the democratic values in the nation's documents, the efforts that were made to impede its implementation and the white rage that it evoked were also deeply American. Even the ruling itself reflected the ambivalence of the court. Chief Justice Earl Warren had a difficult time getting the court to make a unanimous decision on Brown. Rather than set a definite timetable for Southern schools to desegregate, the court set forth the confusing phrase, "with all deliberate speed," which gave Southern school districts the license to stall and procrastinate. The rage that Brown evoked among white Southern lawmakers in Congress and among white constituencies epitomized the deep racial legacy in the U.S. that had existed since slavery. Racial progress in the U.S. throughout its history has always been attained through struggle. As Frederick Douglass stated, if there is no struggle, there is no progress. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet deprecate agitation are men who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its many waters. This struggle may be a moral one, or it may be a physical one. And it may be both moral and physical, but it must be struggle. For all of its shortcomings, and there were many, both in the decision and its consequences, Brown brought the United States closer to its democratic ideals. Gunnar Myrdal stated that most Americans experience an American dilemma because of the gap between the American creed values they internalize, such as equality and democracy, and the institutionalized racism that exists in U.S. society. In declaring that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal, the Supreme Court empowered Blacks in tightly segregated communities such as Aubrey and Mariana to challenge a system of racism that had been entrenched since the post-Reconstruction period. Brown, in the developments prior to and immediately after it, brought hope to Blacks and other marginalized communities of colors in cities and towns that were racially segregated. Yet today we are experiencing the reemergence of white nationalism and blatant institutional racism at the federal level that is unprecedented since the presidential administration of Woodrow Wilson. Wilson screened the racist movie Birth of a Nation in the White House on February 18, 1915, and introduced racial segregation into the federal government. Presidents over the last 70 years have, to varying degrees, supported racial justice. Harry Truman, who was not a strong advocate of racial justice, issued an executive order in 1948 which desegregated the military. Dwight D. Eisenhower sent troops to Little Rock, Arkansas, to protect Black students who desegregated Central High School in 1957. In a televised address to the nation on June 11, 1963, President John F. Kennedy issued a moral challenge to Americans and announced that he would send legislation to Congress outlawing discrimination in public facilities. Kennedy said, when Americans are sent to Vietnam or West Berlin, we do not ask for whites only. It ought to be possible, therefore, for students of any color to attend any public institution they select without having to be backed up by troops. President Lyndon B. Johnson, a Southerner from Texas, who had been a high school teacher, worked hard for the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. He also initiated many reforms which became known as the Great Society that benefited African Americans, other people of color, and low-income groups. On March 15, 1965, a few days after the nation had witnessed the brutal beating by police of unarmed civil rights marchers in Selma, Alabama, Johnson delivered a speech to Congress shown on television in which he said, "The real hero of the struggle is the American Negro. His actions and protests, his courage to risk safety and even to risk his life have awakened the conscience of this nation." During the decades from the presidencies of Woodrow Wilson to Donald Trump's second term, most U.S. presidents have either expressed support for racial equity and for African Americans and other groups, or remained silent on racial issues. Unlike his predecessors, President Donald Trump and his supporters have, in both subtle and overt ways, openly expressed and supported institutionalized racism, white nationalism, and authoritarianism. Trump has issued cruel and poignant executive orders designed to erase diversity, content, and issues from schools, colleges, and universities, and U.S. society writ large. His executive order demanding an end to what he calls radical indoctrination in K-12 schooling has slowed the development of teaching about diversity in the schools and presented serious challenges for teachers who want to integrate their curriculum with multicultural content and perspectives. This executive order requires patriotic education that celebrates America's greatness. Among the most egregious of Trump's executive orders that is causing anguish, confusion, and inaction by educators in schools, colleges, and universities is called Ending Radical and Wasteful Government DEI Programs and Preferences. Schools, colleges, and universities are eliminating programs in their commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion in response to the resurgence of white nationalism in the executive orders issued by President Trump. The question tonight we need to wrestle with, deeply examine, and illuminate is why, after 71 years of racial progress since Brown, we are experiencing an organized, well-funded, and successful attacks on diversity, equity, inclusion, multicultural education, and democracy. It is very important to understand the attack is also on democracy. These values are implicit in Brown and in the nation's fundamental documents, such as the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and the Bill of Rights. Why are these regressive policies and tactics being openly supported by President Trump, members of his cabinet, and other political leaders by their silence about Trump's action, which can be interpreted as agreement? In the sections below, I offer three possible explanations for the emergence of white nationalism and racism at this troubled, poignant, and turbulent time in the nation's history. The three possible explanations I will discuss are the persistence of institutional racism, the rising population of people of color, and white's sense of victimization because of the rise of the Black middle class. First, the persistence of institutional racism, a legacy from slavery. When federal troops withdrew from the South as part of the Compromise of 1877, Reconstruction effectively ended, and the South reestablished many elements of white supremacy that existed during slavery, such as the Black Codes. These codes, which varied in different states, were designed to keep Blacks second-class citizens. Some of the codes required Blacks to be employed by a white person and prevented them from owning a gun or testifying against a white person. Rayford Logan, the eminent African-American historian, called this period the nadir. Slavery in the United States ended in 1865, which was 160 years ago. However, the racism that was established in the United States during slavery left a deep legacy, which the nation has not overcome. Gloria Ladson Billings and Nicole Hannah-Jones maintained that the current era of powerful and blatant expressions of white supremacy and racism is a second nature. Actions by presidential candidates and presidents that foreshadowed the rise of white nationalism and racism during Trump's second term, including the visibility and influence that George Wallace of Alabama experienced as a presidential candidate in 1968. Wallace openly supported racial segregation. His mantra was that he would embrace segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever. On June 11th, 1963, he stood in the schoolhouse door to prevent Vivian Malone and James Hood from entering a university building. The persistence of racism in the United States has been extensively documented by publications, by scholars in various disciplines. Harvard Law professor Derek Bell maintained that racism is a foundational and enduring structure in U.S. society that is deeply embedded in law, policy, and national identity. He argued that advances in racial progress only occur when they align with the interests of white power elites. Bell called this concept interest convergence in the permanence of racism. The second explanation that I'm offering as a possibly explain our current situation is the rising population of people of color. The rising population of people of color in the U.S. is an important factor contributing to the rise and overt oppression of white nationalism and racism in recent years. The continual flow of immigrants to the U.S., which is related to the increasing diversity of the population, might also be contributing to fear and unease among many whites. According to a report published by the Pew Research Center, the U.S. population is becoming increasingly diverse, as indicated by the statistics on this slide, which I'll let you read privately. In the United States, as well as within other nations, some politicians and conservative scholars and writers claim that a flood of immigrants is disrupting the nation state by changing its language and culture, putting tremendous demand on the welfare and health system, and taking jobs that are making it difficult for native citizens to earn a living. Research indicates that immigrants actually enrich the U.S. in numerous ways. They accept jobs that many native citizens decline, and they improve the nation in other ways, including by starting new businesses, making scientific innovation, increasing the variety and complexity of its foods, music, dance, and his ways of understanding the world. Non-naturalized immigrants contribute funds to Social Security, which they do not receive. The third explanation is white sense of victimization because of the rise of the Black middle class. The historian Carol Anderson describes how after every period in which African Americans made progress, such as during the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. White rage emerged to halt the gains that blacks had made. The election of Barack Obama as president in 2008 and 2012, the national reckoning about race that took place after the killings of blacks, such as George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and the wide use of the 1619 Project on teaching about slavery, each a manifestation of racial progress, provoked attacks on teaching about race, including the unverified assertion that critical race theory is being taught in K-12 schools. As blacks made progress and entered the middle class in increasing numbers, many whites, especially those living in rural areas and regions with widespread poverty, such as Appalachia, experienced anger and disappointment. They felt that they had been left behind because they remained poor and held low-status jobs such as coal mining and field work on farms, as blacks experienced upper social class mobility. A number of sociological studies describe and illuminate the rage, fear, and disappointment that exists among many low-income whites. Robert Whatnow, in his book, The Left Behind, Decline in Rage in Small-Town America, examines why white Americans voted overwhelmingly for Donald Trump. He concludes that the rage and fury among working-class whites results less from economic concerns and more from the perception that the federal government in Washington is distant from and threatening to the social fabric of their small towns. How should we respond to this attack on democracy, diversity, and equity? Educators should resist the attacks on diversity and equity in schools, colleges, and universities by implementing transformative civic education. The curriculum in most schools consists of mainstream civic education, which is grounded in mainstream academic knowledge. It reinforces the power relationship within society and perpetuates silence about the egregious parts of the nation's history, such as Indian removal, slavery, and the internment of Japanese Americans. Transformative civic education is rooted in transformative academic knowledge. It challenges institutionalized and established knowledge. It enables students to acquire the information, skills, and values needed to break silences about the shameful parts of the nation's history, challenge inequality within their communities, nation, and world, and to take civic action that actualize equality and democracy. Transformative civic education also helps students to acquire cultural, national, and global identifications, which are essential for effective civic action that will enhance democracy and diversity in the nation, in their communities, and in the world. However, to successfully implement transformative civic education, teachers and professors need to be keenly aware and sensitive to the complex and fluid characteristics of the racial, ethnic, cultural, and gender identities of students. In the next two sections, I will describe the fluidity of student racial attitudes and identities and the nature of cultural, national, and global identification. One of the salient characteristics of racial, ethnic, and cultural groups today is the extent to which their members have fluid, multiple, and intersectional identities. During the 1960s, it was often assumed that most Blacks would have a strong Black identity and support efforts to reform the curriculum to include Black history and culture. However, as we consider the fluidity of ethnic and racial groups today and plan teaching for the present and future, we should anticipate and plan for the multiple ways in which ethnic and racial identity and groups are changing and contextual. For example, we cannot assume that all students with a Black phenotype will have a Black identity and support the teaching of Black studies in schools, colleges, and universities. An increasing percentage of Black, Hispanic, and Asian American students have parents from different racial, ethnic, and cultural groups because of the rate of interracial marriage and families are growing in the U.S. There is a significant growth in the number of Americans who are reporting more than one race on the U.S. Census. This population grew from 6.8 million in 2000 to 9 million in 2010 to 38.8 million in 2020. The number of school-aged youth who identify as mixed race is also increasing. Therefore, these issues of identity are very contextual and flexible and changing. Culture and gender are also fluid and contextual. Some students in schools, colleges, and universities have parents of the same gender or who themselves are questioning their gender identity or are uncomfortable with the gender identity they were assigned at birth. Consequently, fluidity and context must be seriously considered as we conceptualize the curriculum for the future and for the present. Political behavior and attitudes related to race and identity, race and ethnicity are also shifting. For example, in the 2024 election, Donald Trump won 48% of the Hispanic vote, which was 18 points more than the 28% he received in 2016, and 14 points more than his 32% in 2020. According to exit polling, Trump won the votes of 1/5 of Black men and nearly half of Latino men. Why? I've been searching for an answer, including talking to my barber, who I almost dropped, but anyway. Anyway, I've been really dealing with these statistics while writing this paper. What's going on with Black men and Latino men? Okay, this is what I've come up with, and it isn't very helpful, I don't think. It seems to me that one of the issues I came across, they have concerns about the economy and illegal immigration. These two groups think that may be affecting them negatively. Another issue that comes up through all the reading I've done is that there's a crisis among men. Did you women know that? There's a crisis among men. I just finished reading reading a book about the crisis among men, and they need your help. There's a crisis among men. I was trying to remember the name of the book I just finished, and I don't. I'll give it to you during the Q&A or some other time. But there is a crisis. Men are, you probably know this, but I'm going to say it anyway. They're experiencing downward economic and educational mobility. And I could go on. That's another lecture, though. As Donald Trump, another reason that Black and Hispanic men may have gone to Trump in bigger numbers, because Trump asserts male dominance and masculinity. If you watch the Republican convention, that was pretty obvious. And I think that although the book I just read is by Miller, I don't remember the title of the book, but her name is Miller-Idriss, Man Up. Isn't that what it's called, Cherry? Man Up. I just finished reading it. I was trying to get some insight into what happened to Black and Hispanic men, what's going on in their minds. For this lecture, I wanted to tell you, but I'm still searching. I interviewed my barber, and like I say, I almost dropped him after the interview. Anyway, so we need to help men. We need help, and I'm serious. There's a crisis. And like I say, it's another lecture. Can't give that one tonight because Tony, I was given 50 minutes. They really wanted me to take 45, but let me go on so I can keep my 50 minutes. I want to talk a bit about we got to help transformative civic education. Also help kids to develop reflective and thoughtful cultural, national, and global identities. So let me say a little bit about that before I do two more things, and I'll close. I'll reach my 50 minutes. I know Tony is counting. He got his clock watch on. So it reminds me of the Black preacher who would give his text in an hour and then keep preaching. But I'm not in the Black church, so can't do that. So let me move on to the three kinds of identifications. Cultural identification. We really need to help kids in this transformative civic curriculum, help kids develop strong, positive, and clarified cultural identifications and attachments, because they have to feel good about themselves. They can't love other groups or other people till they love themselves. So we gotta help work on that cultural identity for them and help get it right. And these students need to understand, they need to see themselves in the curriculum, they need to feel good about themselves. But they also need to learn about racism and all of that, but we can't just imply that they are victims. We have to help them understand efficacy. They can't be depicted as just victims. Okay, that's cultural identity. I won't say no more. By the way, you can read the brown paper. It comes out. Felice Levine can tell you when it comes out. Mine is already drafted, so I'm ahead of the game, I was told. The real paper is drafted, even though I wrote the talk paper, which is shorter, for 50 minutes. Then we, in addition to cultural identity, we have to help kids develop their national identity as American, as British, as French. National identity is important. Now, what have we done wrong in developing a national identity? In trying to develop a national identity, most nations have tried to develop a kind of patriotism and to strip kids of their cultural identity, as if it's either or. Will Kimlicka points out that identity is not a zero-sum game. Rather, multiculturalists view identity as multiple, nested, and overlapping. I can be a good black man and a good American. I don't have to, it's not either or. I don't have to give up being black to be a good American or to be a good globalist. So we have to understand that these identities, we don't have to give, it's not zero sum. We don't have to give up one to get the other. And that's the mistake we've made. We've tried to get rid of kids' cultural identity and to give them a national identity. Third, we need to help them get a global identity. The world, this is a global world. And I've written a lot on global identity, but again, that's another lecture. When I get invited back to AERA, my global identity lecture, but I can't give it in 50 minutes. So the global, and with the global issue, we got to also help kids develop cosmopolitan values and human rights values. That's my global lecture. I can't give that one tonight, but it's really important that kids have to develop their cultural identities, their national identities, and a global identity, which includes a commitment to cosmopolitan values and human rights. And again, just put it in the notes, read it when the paper comes out. I do develop it in the paper version of this talk. Let me go on to conclude as soon as I can I'm going to promise within 5 minutes. And I wasn't keeping time, but I know he was. I am about to just do two more things before I wrap this up. One is I've been talking about teaching kids to act, to participate in civic action. So the question is, what did Jim Banks do to respond to this new racism? I took action. And in this action, the next slide they'll show you, in this action, what was my action? I edited this book. That was my action, to respond to these times. I edited this book called Standing Strong in Undemocratic Times, Supporting Diversity and Enhancing Democracy in Education. I edited this book because I felt compelled to help educators to resist the attacks on diversity, equity, inclusion, multicultural education, and democracy. I also edited this book to commemorate the 30th anniversary of the multicultural education series of books I edit at Teachers College Press, Columbia University. So 2 goals. What did I ask authors to do in this book? I asked the authors to do 2 things. One, to describe the difficulties they envision for multicultural education for the next decade. And secondly, I asked them to describe interventions and action that can be taken by educators and policymakers to lessen and reduce these challenges. This book will be released at AERA meeting in LA in April 2026 by Teachers College Press. Okay, let me move to the conclusion. And Tony, you can tell me later how well I did with the 50 minutes. He's smiling, so maybe I'm close. I started this lecture talking about silences. Silences in the Black community about Brown. Silences in Lee County. And I'm going to end this lecture also talking about silences. I'm going to talk about the silences that exist in our nation today. The silence about Brown in my Southern Black community was overt. Silence is complicated and is both positive and negative. It can be a powerful means for mental, physical, and social survival, as well as a vehicle for controlling people and limiting their ability to engage in effective civic action. The silence in my Southern Black community caused by the Brown decision exemplified both positive and negative consequences. Whites in my community limited information and communication about the Brown decision to maintain control of Black educators and schools. The silence about Brown enabled Black educators to maintain their cultural efficacy and safety. Silences are not limited to any one group or particular time in history. All of us have silences in our personal and family stories, in our communities, and in the nation. Many white families are silent about their African American ancestors, either because they do not know them or because of shame. Some Black individuals or families who have white phenotypes are silent about their Black heritage because of job mobility and their desire for cultural and structural inclusion. Silence exists in some Jewish refugee families about certain aspects of their Holocaust experience. The Issei, first-generation Japanese Americans, are often silent about their experiences in the internment camps during World War II because of shame and embarrassment and their belief that focusing on the past might negatively influence future generations of their families. There are silences in school textbooks and the school curriculum about our nation's unsavory history. School textbooks were silent for many decades about the brutalities of slavery, Indian removal, and the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. President Trump's executive orders that prohibit exhibits about race and African Americans and that erase the horrors of slavery in the various Smithsonian museums are attempts to silence shameful parts of the nation's history. Asking students to identify silences within their communities, the nation, and the world can be the initial phase of historical and social science and research that can lead to civic action. Identifying silences can provide a foundation for students to fully engage their efficacy as citizens and thoughtfully participate in efforts to expand the rights and opportunities for diverse groups. Teachers can ask students to research these questions. Why do silences exist in our communities, the nation, and the world? Whose interests do silences serve? How can these silences be uncovered and made explicit? How does making them explicit enable us to identify ways in which communities, nation, and the world can be made more just and equitable? By uncovering silences and making them explicit, students can formulate civic action that they can take to enhance justice and equality. The silence, loss, anger, and hope that Brown evoked still simmer in communities throughout the United States. Schools throughout the nation are now resegregated. Many Blacks feel that whenever they make progress in education, housing, health, jobs, and other areas, they will experience backlash. There is white anger about affirmative action and immigration and Black anger about their plight in America. White anger has resurfaced in the form of executive orders that ban diversity, equity, and inclusion from schools, colleges, and universities, and society writ large. Black anger has resulted in renewed efforts to fully participate in American society through increased voter turnout in elections and protests like the Black Lives Matter movement, in which many white allies in the United States, as well as in other nations, have participated. The journey toward and after Brown has been long and difficult. However, Brown gave us hope that America one day may overcome its deep and entrenched racial legacy, and indicated how difficult this journey was and still is. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Banks, for your powerful and compelling lecture. Your deep understanding of the challenges facing our nation's education systems not only serves as a wake-up call, but also inspires action among scholars, policymakers, and practitioners. We will now move to the discussion and the Q&A portion of the evening. We want to encourage our online audience to submit questions through the streaming platform. And for our in-person audience, we will have microphones set up soon. I am pleased to introduce our moderator for the evening, Adam Harris, who will guide the discussion and introduce our commentators. Adam Harris is an author and journalist based in Virginia. He is Senior Fellow at the New America's Education Policy Program. He contributes to The Atlantic, The Argument, and he was previously a reporter at the Chronicle of Education and The Atlantic, and the social editor at ProPublica. His essays and reporting have also appeared in the New York Times, The Guardian, BBC, and Ebony. Thank you so much, Mr. Harris, for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you all so much for being here. I would like to welcome our commentators to the stage. We have Professor Kimberly Robinson, the founding director of the Education Rights Institute and a professor at the University of Virginia School of Law. And we have Andrea Centino, the DC Regional Counsel of the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund. Thank you all so much for joining me and for joining us. And Dr. Banks, thank you again for such an engaging, thoughtful lecture. If I could take a moment of moderator's privilege, I will have our commentators respond to your address momentarily. But the articulation of the way that silence has worked as both a security blanket as well as a tool to quell dissent, I thought was incredibly thoughtful. And the way that you talked about the ways that our curriculum sort of maintain that, they maintain that silence, the way mainstream curriculums reinforce our mainstream knowledge. And it made me think back to my own grandfather and the stories that he didn't get to tell me. You know, he's a man born in 1931 in Alabama on Choctaw land, land that was, you know, the first land taken during the Indian Removal Act in the 1830s, a century before he was born. And it really made me think about what it would mean to force us to be more honest about where we have been so that students can develop that sort of moral character to understand what's necessary to avoid going backwards. What does a curriculum look like that leaves silence behind? You talked about your teachers in school, the ones who gave you the curriculum about the United States, what it meant to be a citizen of the US, what it meant to be a Black citizen in the United States. But what is that last piece? What does it mean to be a human and exist in a multicultural society? And I think that is incredibly important. And then what does it mean for all of us to have them share some of those same ideals? That's why I'm so excited to have this conversation today. Professor Robinson, I'm going to start with you. Would you like to offer a few remarks on Dr. Banks' speech?
Yes, thank you very much. So first, thank you for having me, Dr. Tavis and Dr. Nguyen, for this invitation, and really excited to be here tonight. So I'm going to just offer a few reflections on Dr. Banks' remarks. So I want to sort of jump off of this point of silence and also institutional racism. So I would say that one of the central flaws that we have as we think about the Brown decision and the just enduring legacy of institutional racism is that while we often look to lawyers to enforce desegregation orders, to bring lawsuits against districts that were segregated, we did not give voice to teachers and educators and principals and school board members to truly understand and bring equal educational opportunity to life in our schools. So the central flaw there, and I say this as a lawyer, so I am a lawyer, I'm not denigrating lawyers in any way, but what we did was we looked to the courts to say, okay, we are going to require you to take particular action. Here's the court decree. You have to follow this decree. But that is only doing things such as sort of looking at the demographics of students in the district, looking at the teachers in the district. But that doesn't say anything about the multiple layers that need to happen for equal educational opportunity to be brought to life. When we empower teachers, when we empower principals, when we empower school board members and district leaders to fully understand what's at stake in equal educational opportunity, then and only then do I believe that we can truly bring equal educational opportunity to life. And unfortunately, what we did was a very thin version of Brown, right? We sort of took this very legal route, but we didn't fully embrace what it was intended to accomplish. So I think the second part of that challenge is that one of the things that the Brown lawyers were truly focused on was this idea of addressing the resource disparities between schools, between largely then Black and brown schools and white schools. And so the lawyers that were litigating the Brown cases and other similar cases across the country had a phrase, and they said, green follows white. They understood that the white schools were the ones that were the best funded. And so therefore, integration would not just allow students to learn from others who are unlike them, to attend the same schools, to learn together, to play together, to become friends, right? It wasn't just about that. It never was. It was also about addressing the resource disparities between the schools that we still see the legacy of today because, again, we took this very thin approach to Brown and did not really implement it fully with all of the actors in the building in a more holistic way. And then finally, I want to also draw upon what Dr. Banks said about when the court focused on the harm of Brown, it noted specifically the harm to African American students. And I think, again, this is why we have such a thin understanding of Brown. The harms of segregation were not solely to African Americans. They were harms to our very social fabric that we live on in our nation. They were harms to our economy as well, because when you do not fully develop all people and all students, you harm your economy. And they were certainly, as Dr. Banks pointed out, harms to our democracy. And so it is that fuller understanding of what was at stake in Brown and what we still have, I believe, the opportunity to bring to life today is this more robust understanding of equal education opportunity that we need to bring to our schools and to our school boards and to our districts. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Ms. Centino.
Thank you, and good evening. Thank you for having me here tonight for this really dynamic discussion. For those of you who are not as familiar with MALDEF, we are a national civil rights legal organization that works on behalf of all Latinos living in the United States to protect their civil rights and to protect the constitutional rights of all people in the U.S. And we were founded in the model of the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund. And so really I reflected on this lecture from my perspective as a Mexican American lawyer, a civil rights lawyer, a public, an education policy advocate, a millennial, and a parent. And as I reflected on kind of with all of that in mind, what this lecture really prompted for me weren't necessarily the legal questions, but the questions that revolved around history, society, community, and the importance of experiential solutions to what we are seeing right now. This theme of silence that people have already touched on and that you discussed, Dr. Banks, it really resonated with me and got me thinking about what that silence looks like in my own life, whether it's in my personal experience or professional experience. And so, with that, I grew up not knowing much about my ancestors, about my family's ancestral connection to Mexico, really beyond my grandparents, their stories as immigrants, even my own parents' stories as first and second generation Mexican Americans and what they lived through. And really that was, in part, I think, because they were part of a population that was othered. And that experience was painful. And so there had always been a lot of secrecy or shame or silence about our family history. And I know that I'm not unique in that experience. And then in my work, I certainly see how silence comes into play because I see how silence, for one example, is used to try to mitigate harm. For instance, we have many clients, or we represent people and our community on issues that touch on immigrants' rights. And so for individuals who are undocumented immigrants, or maybe who do have an immigration status but are not U.S. citizens or a green card holder, right, there's silence about their immigration status or what they experience because of the risk that carries in certain situations. And I can also see many of the situations where silencing is used for a tool of oppression, as you discussed. So, efforts to silence speaking Spanish, efforts to marginalize Latino culture unless it can be commodified. And too often, especially right now, we are seeing that any voice that presents a challenge to the status quo is a voice that's targeted to be silenced. And so that theme, I think really cuts across cultures, across generations. It's very broadly applicable to connect the experiences of many people in the U.S. today. And as I thought about that and your comments, Dr. Banks, about transformative civic education and an education that's rooted in human rights, and developing kind of all the different identities that you described, I also see a lot of opportunity there to build a positive vision for the U.S. that's built not simply on the theoretical ideals of democracy, but around what kind of life we all believe that people should be able to live. And so I think there, we have a lot of ground to cover, and also we have a lot of points of reference in history that would be really useful, eras like Reconstruction, to build upon.
Thank you so much. Dr. Banks, I know we've had you talking for for about 15 minutes, so I don't. I'm gonna.
Oh, I went over 5.
So I'm gonna let you. I'm going to let you rest your vocal cords for just a moment. And in the meantime, I would like to thank our sign language interpreters. Like, you all have been incredible. Thank you. I was thinking about, Professor Robinson, you were saying that we didn't embrace what Brown was intended to establish, right? If we sort of understand it as a resource segregation issue as well as a racial segregation issue, what should we be making of this resegregation that we've seen, legal sort of resegregation that we've seen, and through various strategies, right? Annexation of different school districts. I'm thinking St. George Parish in Louisiana, some of the districts out in Birmingham, Alabama. And the resource stratification, the additional resource stratification that has since caused.
Yeah, so I think part of what we see is we don't have any, we're losing that sense, or maybe we just never fully had it, that sense of this common and shared and intertwined destiny in our nation, right? This siloing of interests and people and communities. And that's not just along racial lines, right? That's true also for many rural communities. Dr. Banks touched on that some. There's a variety of geographic lines as well as income lines that are different divides that we see in terms of resource inequity. And so I think part of what we need is a deeper understanding of how delivering a high quality public education for all schools and remedying those inequities would serve us all well. And it really actually leans into Derek Bell's idea of interest convergence. In other words, nobody wins by delivering a low quality education to large populations in the United States. And yet we do it decade after decade, generation after generation. And so this really should not be a partisan issue. This is not a terribly controversial idea that I'm suggesting. But I think part of what we have not done is built those coalitions of strange bedfellows, right? I think rural communities and inner city communities are feeling some of the same harms. They just don't see their interests as aligned. And I think we do a better job of building those alliances. Even if you're not going to agree on everything, you might agree on high quality public education for everyone. And I think it's because of that disintegration of that bond that we need to share as, frankly, as Americans, that high quality education, public education is a shared American value. And I think if we could move in that direction, I think we could make some better commitments to what does that high quality public education look like.
Yeah, and Ms. Santino, Dr. Banks was talking about the articulation, how Brown was fundamentally an articulation of the reality of our laws, right? If the law says that, we think back to the Declaration, you think through the Constitution, you think back through the ideas of all people are created equal. This was America trying to live up to that value. What do we make of the tendency to not only stall the progress towards that value, but to actually erase the progress towards that value?
I think that, yes, right. I very much what you said about this gap between the ideals and the reality, right? I think not only does that resonate, but I think we've all seen it and lived it in many different ways. And, at this point in time, right, I think that what has been difficult about doing this work as a civil rights lawyer or as someone who does public policy advocacy has been that there is this difficulty in getting clarity, even amongst each other, with what that gap means and how big the gap is. And how do we kind of navigate together to close it? And really, how are we going to identify not just the shared vision, but also the path to build the practices and the real life applicable kind of actions that need to be taken in order to make it to that place, so that we're not just always in the pursuit of an ideal, but we are actually taking the steps and taking real meaningful practices every day to make that a reality for people. And so when you ask about kind of what do we make of the broader kind of erasure, I guess, of the progress, I think that, when I look at where we are, those who are anti-democratic have had a very clear vision for a very long time about what they want, about the America that they want to see. And part of their strategy has been that intentional erasure in many different ways and the weaponized silence that Dr. Banks has talked about. And so for me, I think, it is it's a difficult problem to grapple with, but one that we'll have to figure out how to be shedding that sunlight on what we are seeing while also educating students about our history, their own history, the interconnectedness of everything that they are living in that moment, and how that connects to civics, the government, policy, and really also lifting up, right, the lived experiences of students who have the expertise in all of that because of what they've already been living, whether that's because they, come from a low-income family and have already had to experience being on welfare, or because they have family who are undocumented and have experienced what deportation looks like. And so, I think that figuring out a way to leverage all of that in transformative civic education can be a way to combat that erasure. And I recognize that that does require kind of a deeper level discussion about what is our shared vision, what is the philosophy of that vision, and how are we going to take practical, or how are we going to put that into practice to make democracy not an ideal, but a practice.
In just a little bit, we are going to open up for questions. So we have the 2 microphones, and you should be getting those wheels turning. I'm one of those people who has to write his down as I'm listening to things. So if you're like me, then pull that notes app out. And online, you will also be able to ask questions, just as a heads up. So be thinking about those. Dr. Banks, I actually did want to give you a chance. You were talking about sort of reflective cultural, national, and international identification. That last piece, right, to have that international identification, to have that global identification, is to fundamentally identify with the ideas that we should care about other humans because we would hope that other humans care about us. Can you talk to me and tell us a little bit more about how you begin to cultivate that global identity in students, right? It just like a little taste so that when they see the paper that they will be.
Yeah,
On?
it's on.
Is this-
It's on.
That's a very good question. I think that, first of all, we have a lot to work against because the kind of conservative movement is anti-globalist. They see the globalists as the enemy. I think what's really important is to make it somewhat, and I've developed a kind of typology. I've developed many typologies, some of which I forget. But anyway, it's really important for kids to be grounded in their own identity. If you're a Mexican American, you're not going to be able, I'm hypothesizing, to really care that much or identify with your black neighbor unless you feel good about yourself. So I'd say starting that these 3 identities, cultural, national, and global, are interrelated, and that they build upon each other, even though it's not necessarily sequential, but it is interactive. That to really help kids develop effective global identities, they have to have some sense of their own cultural identity, some sense of how their national identity and how they interact. So I think it's really, it's a tremendously neglected component of the social studies curriculum, in part because I said we have to work against forces that see the global as negative. And we see that even at the national level right now. But I think they're interrelated, but as a real foundation, we start with strong cultural and national identities, and then we can work on the global. That's a brief answer.
Yeah. No, and I think that that's a really good articulation of it. I think, so the last one, and then I will open it up to questions. Considering that sort of idea of transformational civic education, alongside the idea of that we've seen so many times, right? The sort of several iterations of patriotic education. I'm a military kid, and so I've never been one to like say, hey, you can take patriotism and that's your label because my dad served and we have an idea of patriotism, right? But it can very easily devolve into a jingoism if you're not careful. And that idea of transformative civic education is actually important. Can you talk about the importance of that distinction?
Yeah, I think it's the kind of thoughtless kind of nationalism, which is promoted by phrases like patriotic nationalism, or whatever it's being called right now, is in effect not giving kids the opportunity to think. And so I talk about transformative civic education, clearly helping kids develop national attachment, but a thoughtful nationalism. James Bowen, I wish I could use the quote, but I'll paraphrase, that to love America is also to criticize it. That we can't really value and be effective citizens unless we can see its faults, unless we can see the gap between the ideals and the realities, and a patriotic, thoughtful citizen work to close the gap between the ideals and the reality. So I think it's really important to develop reflective patriotism and reflective nationalism and not a non-thinking.
Absolutely. So we have a microphone here and a microphone here. If you would like to start making your ways to the microphone, I actually have one question that I will ask as folks are making their way so that they can continue to think about their questions a little bit. And this one's for the lawyers, because we have seen across institutional levels, teachers, professors being warned or worse for teaching such sort of accurate reflections of history. That can lead to a sort of despondency. It can lead people to feeling like there's nothing that they can do to push back. How legally, what have we actually seen happening in these cases?
So there's a lot of cases.
There's a lot of cases.
But I will say there definitely have been courts. So one of the things that the Department of Justice, Office of Civil Rights came out with was, a guidance talking about unlawful DEI, as well as the executive order that said that, and radical indoctrination. And a federal court has certainly already ruled that this would be a violation of the First Amendment, in part because it's vague exactly what it covers, right? One of the things that can raise First Amendment concerns is that if people aren't entirely clear about exactly what would violate the law. And so one of the concerns with the idea that DEI is illegal is that what constitutes DEI? So teaching historical facts, is teaching history. And so this idea that is DEI, I think, is a false narrative. And so I think one of the things the court has said is that, or lower federal courts have said, is that, it's not clear how teachers could comply with this, number one. And two, it's clearly viewpoint discrimination. You can only say certain things and not other things. And that's another kind of bedrock First Amendment principle. And so that's some of what the courts have said. Do you want to jump in with? There's a lot of cases. So that was just a brief intro.
There are so many. And so I think, it's hard to kind of sum them all up to say, here is where we are now necessarily. But I will say that, I will acknowledge that, right, we find ourselves in such a difficult time that oftentimes what you can do feels scary and uncomfortable and comes maybe with risk or maybe with, a sliding scale of risk. But certainly in the education space where, we have grappled a lot with anticipatory kind of compliance and trying to find ways to support educators, administrators, and others in the education space against, right, compliance early on compliance without, knowing that what is coming at you is unlawful, and that you're being given these directives from an administration that either doesn't have the authority to do that or is telling you to engage in something that is unlawful. And so, I think that those conversations at the community level about how you're going to address that, what is the plan here, are incredibly necessary, because unfortunately, I think we also find ourselves in a time where, yes, what we do as lawyers is important, and I obviously feel that the work I do and my colleagues do is necessary, but so much of what we're seeing right now is more than the legal response, the litigation response, but it's also the community response. And so not just what's happening in your classroom, but what's happening in your community presents so many opportunities for resistance and support.
I think we have some questions online. George.
Yes. There are a lot of questions online. Actually, we are hearing from a lot of K-12 teachers and administrators, as well as university faculty members. And they're asking, what are some of the practical actions that teachers and other faculty members could take to implement transformative civic education? And that is especially in our current political climate, where diversity, equity, and inclusion are either challenged or illegal.
Well, I think that in my paper that I addressed that slightly. Again, I only had 50 minutes. I'm trying to think of, I think one, teachers need to look at kind of historic examples, such as Given's books, A Fugitive Pedagogy, which I mentioned in the paper that I wrote, where look at examples of my teachers who, in the South, back to Given's book, Fugitive Pedagogy, he talks about how teachers, Black teachers in the South, integrated Black history into the curriculum without insulting or going to jail, without insulting the structure, so that find creative ways to bring content into the curriculum without head-on violating the law, but do it subtly and effectively. And Jarvis Givens, in his book, Fugitive Pedagogy, gives some examples of teachers doing that. But looking at my own teachers, how they brought in George Washington Carver, these weren't, they didn't bring in Du Bois, but they brought in George Washington Carver, and they brought in Marian Anderson, and so forth. So I think looking at some historic examples, trying to, within the framework that exists, bring it in examples without trying to confront the system directly, I think can be done. Is there more water? Thank you.
So I'm actually going to jump on that as well. So I do think it's important right now, especially that classroom teachers, principals, school board members, and others are equipping themselves and understanding exactly what is lawful and what isn't lawful. And this is not an encouragement to say, call the general counsel. It's really, you can do that in your district, but one of the things to understand is that much of what is being called unlawful right now actually is not unlawful. And so I'm just going to give a shameless plug here for the Education Rights Institute that I founded. So we are doing a webinar next Tuesday that explains Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, which is the law that's being used as a hammer right now against DEI, to explain exactly what does this law say. Because there's a lot of misunderstanding. And one reason I founded this actually 2 years ago was because there was a lack of understanding at the school level, at the district level, what this law means. And there's this reliance on district council to comply with the law instead of simply implementing it in a robust way that really brings equal educational opportunity to life. And so that's one thing to do, is equip yourself in that understanding of, okay, what actually is lawful and isn't. Teachers are an amazing resource, and they are the ones and principals and other school leaders who are making decisions about what to teach and what not to teach in many instances. And so you want to equip yourself with an understanding of actually what is the law saying currently, what are some of the current court cases saying, and how does that just affect what's possible in the classroom. So I hate to say this corny, but knowledge is power. And so understanding that, equipping yourself with knowledge is really important, I think, particularly. It's always been important. I think it's important now to address the concerns that you raised.
And the other thing I suggest in my big paper is that teachers can form support groups. And I give the example of Peggy McIntosh work, so that teachers can support each other, and that can be a factor that can be helpful.
And I just want to quickly add to this, I think, discussion, and I want to give full credit to MALDEV's president and general counsel, Thomas Saenz, who I've heard talk about this issue, which is, how do we rethink civics education in the United States? And really, there is an opportunity to recognize the comparative advantage that some students have in the realm of civics, whether that's, students from a racial minority, students from low-income families, students who have mixed status families, students who have experienced firsthand what civics means, what government is in their own lives, and really, how do you, whether the issue is economics, immigration, the criminal legal system, or any other public policy that, you may want to talk about, how do we lift up and recognize that experience that they have and how meaningful it is in civics education when you compare that maybe to students who might not have that firsthand experience. And when we think about civics education, I recognize in many places it's been eviscerated. But when we think about civics education, we traditionally think of it as a reward for students who have performed well in other areas of education, whether that's Model UN, government, whatever it may be. But is there opportunity there to really prioritize the contributions and the experience that certain students have and use that as a way to engage them, not just in the civics education where, you can see where there is that opportunity, I think, for success. But then what that success might mean in the other areas of curriculum for those students. And so is there a way that we can rethink how we structure, identify, prioritize students, and recognize the contributions that those students have because of their lived experience?
Thank you so much. George?
Okay. Another question, Professor Banks. How can the multicultural curriculum model be used to affect change?
Well, it seems to me that, I keep forgetting I'm not in the classroom. I think that the multicultural curriculum involves having students examine the history of change, how change takes about, and leads to kids participating in action to bring about change in their school, their community, and the nation. So I think action is an integral part of the notion of the multicultural curriculum.
Just a second part of that. Talking about a sort of that sort of action being a part of multicultural curriculum, there's a part of action that is really just sort of engagement, right? Where it's like to begin to act, right? To begin to engage. And a part of that is to move away from that silence that we have generally experienced. I think that there's like an extra connection that needs to be made that I believe that you were making here. It's just, what does staying silent around children rob them of, right? If you are actually, if they're kind of up to the 7th grade, 8th grade, 9th grade, and you're not actually talking and being frank with them about the realities, what does that rob them of?
Well, it robs them of the incentive for action, and they do not see the possibility of why act if they are kept, If we erase their histories, we erase the problems in the community, we erase notions of sexism and racism. It's when we bring these issues, and it happened in my college class. Most of my students in my social studies and methods courses were young white women, and to get them to talk about discrimination, I often had them look at sexism, where they brought their personal stories that they could understand, and they could use that as a mirror to look at racism, starting with their own journey, starting with their own experience. And so I think starting where people are, starting with their own experience, is a way to get them to discuss, to have vision, and what I call in my paper, breaking the silences.
Yeah, so it is effectively, right, going back to that root of ensuring that the student kind of knows themselves, right? Because if you're saying, hey, think about sexism, but they don't think of themselves in that way, it may it may be more difficult to have them make that sort of relational thought. I wanted to stay there for one more second, then I'll take one more from online. You talked a little bit about what I've heard called, right, the second curriculum before, right? It is the curriculum that sort of undergirds the rest of the things you learn in the HBCU context, which I have historically been in. It means that not only did you learn your maths and your reading and your sort of liberal arts, but you also learned what it meant to be a person of your race, what it meant to exist in that sort of context. Is that something that we still get at home in a like significant way, that it can be just sort of supplemented by the educational experience? Because I think that was part of that second curriculum thought, was you get part of it at home, you get the rest of it at school, right? And so how do we ensure that those ideas, those places, those vehicles for student growth exist together in the same ecosystem?
Well, it's hard to know what kids are getting from home today because of the complexities of homes, the complexities of what's happening in the incredible poverty. I just read, I don't know if you saw the New York Times article, did you see it about a day ago, about the number of homeless kids in the Seattle, in New York City schools? So I think talking about the home culture is a complex one. And how do we make that bridge? I'm not sure. I'd have to give it more thought. But certainly having kids talk about their life experiences, bringing that as I did with the white teachers, bringing their own experiences as a vehicle for looking at issues is important.
George?
Okay. Well, social science research was pivotal in the Brown decision, particularly the Clark-Dow study. How can we use education research today to inform and influence future court decisions, legislation, and/or policy?
Well, I think we have to pray today. I'm a AME. To use research today. I don't know. I'd like to get the audience involved in this because I'm beginning to feel like a prophet. But I think using research today, given our atmosphere, it's going to be really trying and difficult. I think we need first political action to influence our leaders and the leaders we get. And I think the research will have to follow. I think it's the political leadership. No, I'm not sure. Research is going to make a difference.
So I think one of the ways that we can have research influence policy is to make research accessible and digestible. So I've been a scholar for over 20 years. I've edited books and written very long articles. That's not accessible to most people. They're not going to want to read something with 250 footnotes. And so I think we have to get research out of the academy and into communities and into the hands of policymakers and in the ways that they can actually use it to inform policy. And so I'm actually not convinced that policymakers are anti-research. I actually think it's that policymakers have a wide variety of demands on their time. And so because of that, they need the research really in concise, presentations for them where you hit the highlights and you help them understand, okay, here's what the 20 lit reviews on this boil down to in 2 pages, right? So I think a lot of policy members would take in that kind of information, but they don't really have time to read all of those lit reviews like we, as scholars, that we do if we're going to write something about a topic. So I think that's one of the things. One of the sponsors of today's event, Learning Policy Institute, does this very well. They take great research and translate it so that policymakers can use it. And so that's something we're doing at the Education Rights Institute. I know there are other research centers that are doing that. It's getting the research out of the academy into the hands of policymakers. And one of the things I heard as a scholar coming along was you not only write the longer article, but you also write the editorial, you write the short commentary when you publish something. And I think as scholars, we could all do a better job of that, of taking our ideas and making them accessible so that you get what we like to call uptake, which is that those ideas in research are circulating among policymakers, among people that are acting. So those are some of the ways that it can happen.
And I guess I would just add that to your, to Professor Robinson's points earlier about kind of the different facets of education benefits when you were talking about, the Brown decision, today as we think about the role of research, especially in influencing policy, I do think we have to think very broadly about all of the ways in which education and educating all students and ensuring that all students not just have equal opportunity, but also, have equal outcomes, right? And what does that look like? What does that mean for our society economically? How is that good for everybody, right? Has to be part of how we conceive of the research and how we explain it to policymakers, to our community members, in order to build that support for our positive agenda.
I just wanted to say one other thing. When I was responding, I was thinking of the current administration and their attitude toward research. I agree with all the things you said, but I was really thinking of research in the current atmosphere. But go ahead. I just want to answer that.
Question at the microphone? You can take one more.
Dr. Banks, you used a word early on in your presentation that really struck me, subversive. You said it would have been viewed as deeply subversive for your teachers to discuss Brown v. Board with their students, and that's clearly true. But the decision, Brown v. Board, was a Supreme Court decision. It's U.S. law. So it would have been deeply subversive for teachers to discuss U.S. law with their students. And we see this today as well. Laws that are justice-focused are wrongly decided or radical or subversive or just ignored. My question is, given that the laws we tend to love are those that support the status quo and support the oppressive structures already in place, how do we deal with the double standard, not just of which people are deserving of respect, but of which laws are deserving of respect?
I'm sorry, would you say that? Come around once more with your question.
Sure.
I'm sure I understood it.
We've got a double standard, not of just which people we see as deserving of respect in the United States, but of which laws we see as deserving of respect. There's a deep disrespect for many progressive laws, just as there was this idea that teachers discussing Brown v. Board, U.S. law, with their students would have been subversive, right? It's something about the progress that makes some laws, like some people, more deserving of our respect and attention than others. How do we address that?
I think it depends on who has the power, who decides what's subversive. The reason the teachers would have been considered subversive in Lee County, Arkansas, was the white elites had the power, and they were defining what stances people took and how they evaluated. But I think I'm going to let the lawyer answer your question.
That's a fascinating question. My reaction is probably not the one that you're looking for, but my thought is, teaching is an act of courage. Teaching is a courageous profession, whether that is in the classrooms or in, universities. And so, you know, this idea that only some laws and others can be taught. I mean, I teach at a prominent law school, University of Virginia School of Law, and you know, we teach all of the laws. And so I think it's important to, I think that's not just, should not just be true in law school. I think that should be true, you know, throughout our schools and universities. And so, you know, this idea of sort of picking and choosing which laws we're really to talk about, I think is in some ways, is allowing fear to overcome sort of courageous strain that I think runs through most teachers. And so that is part of what I think needs to happen.
I guess when I think of your question, and I am not going to answer this as eloquently as I would like to because it's still kind of like bouncing around in my head. But I guess when I think of your question, I think about the need to have an anchor, a philosophical anchor for what I talked about earlier in terms of like, what does it mean to have a good society? What's the life that we want people to be able to live here in the US, and how we connect that to our laws and how we connect that to the development of laws. And I think we have a lot of lessons to learn from the Reconstruction era. Today, I think there's an underemphasis on that era because, however, it created, right, a lot of the institutions, a lot of the rights, the Reconstruction era amendments, a lot of what we value today and what you've touched upon, right, came from that era. And so I think that as lawyers, we have a lot to gain by looking at that period of history and dissecting, analyzing that, and identifying ways to imbue that into our practice today.
Can I just build on that real quick? So I also think it's important when we think about Reconstruction, it was that backlash that came to Reconstruction. So we're living with that same, this is exactly what Dr. Banks was saying, we're living with a backlash. But that's because we were making significant progress. And so this idea of that you can't do DEI, you can't teach certain things, that's because it was making a big difference. And so I do think we're going to see that continued forward movement because we have an entire generation of young people who are sort of awakened to like, whoa, there's a lot of sort of significant inequality, structural racism that's happening in our nation that we need to be part of the generation to fix. And so I think, continuing to push forward on that deeper and more complex understanding of our nation is really critical because it was making a difference in how we understand our nation. You can still love your nation and see the complex problems of your nation, just like you can see your spouse's, flaws, but still love them just as much, right? Just like they see your flaws and still continue to love you. And so I think it's that same idea, right? And so I do think we just need to recognize that the complexities of what was happening as we were moving toward greater understanding of our history and recognition of inequality was moving us forward. And I believe as we continue to stay that course, will continue to move us forward.
So I would ask our panel for one closing thought, a brief closing thought, kind of to sum up this entire conversation. I feel like we've covered so much ground. We're going to leave with a lot to think about. I think one of the nice things about being where I am right now is my work is the work of consideration. So I get to consider things. I get to think deeply about things. And it's been a joy to be able to think with you all today. So I would just ask that we share one closing remark.
I'll start by just saying that, these are such difficult topics when you really start to dig down, but I think they're so critical because the work that I do, I love it and I am deeply committed to it. And I also know that it's not going to be enough without an underwriting kind of philosophical shift to the way we approach these problems and the way we approach society. So I think these are such important conversations. I love it. It pushes me to think harder, more complex, and to grapple. And while it can be uncomfortable, I think sitting with that discomfort and working through it will ultimately yield really positive results, not just for what I think, right, but for how we all approach these problems together.
So I'll just circle back to the comment that I do think at this time we need to, that knowledge is really important. Understanding what the courts are doing, understanding what the law says and what it doesn't say. I think those are particularly critical in bringing those ideas and principles to life. The principle of equal educational opportunity, this bedrock center of Brown, is something that still is a core principle of our Constitution. And so equipping ourselves with how to bring that to life, I think is really critical today.
Dr. Banks?
I think that we are living in really trying times and that we have to really not only maintain hope, but we have to maintain faith. And I wanted to end by quoting Mary McLeod Bethune, the influential Black educator. She said, with faith, without it, nothing is possible, but with it, nothing is impossible. So I think we have to maintain faith, hope, and tenacity.
Thank you so much. And a round of applause for our panel.
Thank you, Dr. Banks, for your compelling 50-minute talk and insight you shared. And thank you for the contributions that you have made along with Dr. Sherry Banks across your career and your lives. Thank you, commentators, Kimberly Robinson and Andrea Centeno and Adam Harris for moderating the discussion this evening. Thank you so much. This was a terrific conversation. We must take what we've begun to grapple with tonight as a starting point and continue the fight towards equity and justice. It is the best and most worthwhile fight. Thank you all for joining us here tonight, those of you who are in person and the thousands of you from across the country, with a special shout out to those who formed watch parties. We appreciate you providing great questions and sharing your support for this event. Please note that we'll be sharing the recording of this lecture and discussion soon, and it will also be available on our YouTube channel and website. And with that, thank you again and have a wonderful rest of your evening. Thank you, panel. Thank you for a terrific conversation, and thank you for the work that you're doing in your respective roles and positions too. I think a comment that I'm leaving with is that we all have something that we can do in our respective roles and positions to take these ideas, to take the idea that has been supported by research, but to your point, Kimberly, we have to make it accessible and actionable, with our teachers, with our students, with our communities. So thank you so much and have a good evening.